Bobby Mitchell's weathered hands trembled as he reached for his oxygen mask, the yellow eyes glowing in the darkness, making his blood freeze mid-breath. The massive, black creature sitting beside his hospital bed bore no resemblance to the small, whimpering puppy he'd pulled from that twisted wreckage 3 years ago. This wasn't his dog. Dr. Patricia Henderson's coffee mug shattered against the kitchen floor as she stared through Bobby's window, her veterinary training screaming warnings her heart refused to accept. The animal's shoulder height matched that of a small horse, its skull broader than any domestic breed, those amber eyes holding an ancient wildness that made her throat constrict with recognition. Bobby's mind raced through 3 years of memories. The way Midnight never barked, only howled at the moon, how he'd open doors with massive paws, the rabbits he'd hunt and devour raw in the backyard. Signs he'd ignored, explained away with desperate love. "Call Sheriff Williams," Pat whispered to her empty kitchen, knowing she was about to destroy the only family Bobby had left. What had been living in their quiet mountain community all this time? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Bobby Mitchell had learned to live with ghosts, but he'd never expected salvation to come with 4 legs and amber eyes. At 67, the retired railroad engineer from Norfolk Southern carried his grief like an old work injury, some days bearable, others crippling. His modest 2-bedroom house in Millbrook, Virginia, sat on 5 acres of Blue Ridge Mountain wilderness, where the morning mist rolled through ancient oaks like the breath of sleeping giants. 3 years had passed since the night that split his world in half. Catherine Katie Mitchell, his wife of 42 years, had been grading second-grade spelling tests at their kitchen table when he'd stormed out after their argument about his drinking. Grace, their 8-year-old granddaughter visiting for the weekend, had been practicing her veterinarian skills on her stuffed animals, dreaming of the day she'd save every creature in need. "Grandpa Bobby, when I grow up, I'm gonna fix all the hurt animals," she'd told him that very afternoon, her gap-toothed smile bright as summer sunshine. The head-on collision with the drunk driver on Route 211 happened at 9:47 p.m. Bobby survived with 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a shattered heart that no surgery could repair. Katie and Grace didn't make it to the hospital. The drunk driver walked away with scratches, got 18 months in county jail, and destroyed the only family Bobby had ever known. The funeral reception had lasted too long, filled with casseroles he couldn't taste and condolences that felt like sandpaper against raw wounds. That's when he'd made his decision. Route 211, the same curve, his old Ford pickup, and finally, peace. He'd been 3 shots of bourbon deep and driving toward his chosen ending when the small black shape appeared in his headlights. The crash that saved his life had been minor, a swerve into an oak tree, deployed airbags, and the discovery of what appeared to be an injured German Shepherd puppy with broken ribs and malnutrition. 8 pounds of trembling fur and trust, looking at him with eyes that seemed to understand loss. Bobby had wrapped the wounded animal in his funeral suit jacket and driven straight to the emergency vet clinic, spending his last $200 on x-rays and antibiotics for a creature that had somehow chosen him. Dr. Patricia "Pat" Henderson, Martha's sister and Millbrook's only veterinarian, had worked on the puppy through the night. "He's got good bones," she'd told Bobby at dawn. "Strong heart. He'll grow into something special if you take proper care of him." Bobby had named him Midnight for the darkness from which they'd both emerged, and for 3 years they'd been each other's reason to wake up each morning. Now, as Midnight's true size filled Bobby's bedroom doorway, those amber eyes reflecting the bedside lamp like twin moons, Bobby realized he'd been living with something far more mysterious than he'd ever imagined. The creature that had saved his life wasn't what it seemed, and the truth would either destroy them both or finally set them free. The morning after his midnight revelation, Bobby sat at his kitchen table nursing black coffee and watching midnight through the window. The massive animal moved with fluid grace through the backyard, inspecting the perimeter with the methodical precision of a security guard. At 120 pounds, Midnight's shoulders reached Bobby's waist, and his paws left tracks the size of dinner plates in the soft October earth. "Something ain't right," Bobby muttered, remembering his grandfather's old saying. "When a dog acts like he's got secrets, maybe he ain't a dog at all." The limp had started 3 days ago when Midnight chased off a family of raccoons trying to raid the garbage cans. What worried Bobby wasn't the injury. It was how Midnight had dispatched the intruders. No barking, no growling, just a silent, predatory stalking that ended with the raccoons fleeing in terror. Real dogs made noise when they defended territory. Midnight hunted like something that had never forgotten how to kill. Dr. Pat Henderson's veterinary clinic occupied a converted farmhouse on Main Street, its waiting room smelling of antiseptic and the lingering fear of anxious pet owners. Bobby had called ahead, knowing Pat would squeeze him in despite her packed schedule. At 71, Pat had delivered half the babies and healed most of the animals in Millbrook over the past 4 decades. If anyone could explain Midnight's unusual characteristics, it would be her. "Well, I'll be damned," Pat whispered, as Midnight filled her examination room doorway. "Bobby, how much has he grown since his last visit?" "About 40 pounds in 6 months," Bobby admitted, feeling foolish for not tracking it more carefully. "Is that normal?" Pat's experienced hands moved over Midnight's frame, her touch professional but cautious. The animal stood perfectly still, those amber eyes tracking her every movement with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. "His bone structure is all wrong for any domestic breed I know. Look at this skull shape, these teeth, and these paws. Bobby, this isn't normal canine development." "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying we need to run some tests." Pat's voice carried the careful tone she used when delivering bad news to pet owners. "Blood work, genetic screening, something comprehensive." The words Bobby dreaded most. Comprehensive tests meant comprehensive bills. His Social Security check of $1,847 barely covered his mortgage, utilities, and medications. The veterinary workup Pat was suggesting would cost at least $200 he didn't have. He'd been eating canned soup and peanut butter sandwiches for weeks just to afford Midnight's regular dog food. "I can see you're worried about the cost," Pat said gently. "Let's call it preventive care. Insurance will cover part of it." Bobby's pride bristled. "I don't take charity, Pat. Never have. It's not charity. It's good medicine." Pat's eyes held the same kindness she'd shown the night she'd saved Midnight's life. "Besides, Martha's already called and offered to help with any bills. Said something about it being the Christian thing to do." Martha Henderson, Pat's older sister, had been Bobby's neighbor for 15 years. At 72, she spent most days watching the neighborhood through her kitchen window, keeping track of everyone's comings and goings with the dedication of an unpaid security service. Her offer of financial help touched Bobby more than he cared to admit. 48 hours for results," Pat said, drawing blood from Midnight's surprisingly cooperative foreleg. "Try not to worry too much." But worry was all Bobby could manage during the longest 2 days of his life since Katie and Grace had died. He found himself studying Midnight with new eyes, cataloging every behavior that had seemed quirky but now felt ominous. The way Midnight never wagged his tail like other dogs, but held it straight out behind him. How he could open doors by turning the handles with his massive paws. The hunting expeditions that left rabbit bones scattered across the yard. The howling at the full moon that sounded more like wilderness than suburb. Most disturbing was Midnight's reaction to vehicles. Any car engine sent the animal into a state of hypervigilant tension, ears flat against his skull, body coiled for flight or fight. Bobby had always attributed it to trauma from being found near the road, but now he wondered if there was something deeper, something instinctual driving that fear. On October 16th, at exactly 3:15 p.m., Pat's call came. "Bobby, you need to come to the clinic right now." "And Bobby?" Her voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before. "Don't bring Midnight." The drive to town took 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. Bobby's hands shook on the steering wheel as he replayed 3 years of memories, searching for clues he'd missed, signs he'd ignored. By the time he reached Pat's clinic, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Pat met him at the door, her face pale as winter. "Bobby, we need to talk." "Bobby, sit down." Pat's voice carried the weight of 40 years delivering difficult diagnoses to pet owners who love their animals like children. The examination room felt smaller somehow, the fluorescent lights too bright, casting harsh shadows across her weathered face. Bobby remained standing, his calloused hands gripping the metal examination table. "Just tell me, Pat, is he sick? Cancer? Something we can fight?" "He's not sick, Bobby." Pat pulled up the test results on her computer screen, the DNA analysis displaying in stark black and white. "He's not a dog." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, impossible to breathe around. Bobby stared at the screen, seeing percentages and scientific terms that might as well have been written in a foreign language. "What do you mean, not a dog?" "Canis lupus, 100%. Bobby, Midnight is a wolf, an eastern wolf to be specific." Pat's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the genetic markers. "This subspecies has been considered extinct in Virginia for over a century. The last confirmed eastern wolf in our state was killed in 1910. Bobby's legs gave out and he collapsed into the plastic chair behind him. "That's impossible. I found him as a puppy. He was tiny, injured. He's lived in my house for 3 years. He sleeps on my bed, Pat. Wolves don't do that." "Wolves raised from infancy by humans can form extraordinary bonds," Pat said gently. "But Bobby, this changes everything. I'm legally required to report this to the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service. Keeping a wolf as a pet is a federal crime. The penalties are severe. $50,000 in fines, possible jail time." "Jail time?" Bobby's voice cracked like an adolescent boy's. "For loving an animal that saved my life?" "The government doesn't see it that way. To them, Midnight is a dangerous wild animal that poses a threat to public safety. They'll want him captured and either relocated to a wildlife facility or—" Pat couldn't finish the sentence. "Or what?" "Or euthanized, especially if they determine he can't be safely relocated." The room spun around Bobby like a carnival ride gone wrong. Euthanized. The clinical term for murder when applied to an animal that had committed no crime except trusting the wrong species. "How long do I have?" "I have to make the call within 24 hours. "It's federal law, Bobby. I could lose my license, face criminal charges myself if I don't report this." Bobby stood up so fast the chair toppled backward. 24 hours? That's it? 3 years of family and you're giving me 1 day? "I'm giving you 1 day more than the law requires," Pat said firmly. "I should have called the moment I saw these results. But I've watched you and Midnight together, Bobby. I've seen how that animal has brought you back from the edge. After Katie and Grace died, you were a walking ghost. Midnight gave you a reason to live." Bobby's anger deflated like a punctured tire. Pat was right. The night he'd found Midnight, he'd been driving toward his own death with a bottle of bourbon and a head full of guilt. The small black creature bleeding in his headlights had derailed his suicide mission and given him 3 years of purpose he'd thought were gone forever. "There has to be something we can do," Bobby said desperately. "Some kind of permit, some legal way to keep him." Private ownership of wolves is prohibited in Virginia, period. Even wildlife sanctuaries need federal permits that take years to obtain. And Bobby, the safety concerns are real. Midnight may seem gentle now, but he's a wild animal. His instincts could kick in at any moment. His instincts already kicked in, Bobby snapped. 3 years ago when he saved my life. Every morning when he brings me my slippers. Every night when he sleeps between me and the door, protecting me from nightmares I don't even remember having. Those are his instincts, Pat. Love and loyalty. Pat's eyes filled with tears she couldn't shed in front of a client. I know, honey. I know. But the law doesn't recognize love when it comes to wildlife. They see a 120-pound predator with the bite force to crush a man's skull. Then don't make the call. Bobby, I can't. 24 hours, you said. Give me 48, 2 more days to figure something out, to maybe find another way. Pat stared at him for a long moment, her professional obligations warring with 40 years of friendship and compassion. 48 hours. But Bobby, there is no other way. Use that time to say goodbye. The drive home passed in a blur of autumn colors Bobby couldn't appreciate through his tears. Midnight was waiting on the porch when he pulled into the driveway, massive head tilted in concern as if he could smell the despair rolling off Bobby in waves. Those amber eyes that had seemed mysterious now looked ancient, wild, belonging to a creature that had never truly been domesticated despite 3 years of shared meals and quiet evenings by the fireplace. "Hey, boy," Bobby said, his voice breaking as Midnight pressed against his legs in greeting. "We need to have a talk." Inside the house, Bobby sat heavily in his recliner while Midnight took his usual position beside the chair, close enough to touch. How many evenings had they spent this way? How many times had Midnight's presence been the only thing standing between Bobby and the bottle of sleeping pills he kept hidden in his medicine cabinet? "I always wondered why you never barked," Bobby said aloud, scratching behind Midnight's ears. "Dogs bark, wolves howl. Should have been my first clue, shouldn't it?" Midnight's ears flicked forward at the sound of Bobby's voice, and for a moment Bobby could swear he saw understanding in those golden eyes. Not the simple comprehension of a well-trained dog, but something deeper, more complex. The intelligence of a wild thing that had chosen, against every instinct, to love a broken old man who'd needed saving as much as he had. "What are we going to do now, boy?" Bobby whispered. "How do I choose between your freedom and my heart?" The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire on a dry August day. By noon on October 17th, Martha Henderson had made exactly 17 phone calls, each conversation beginning with, "You're not going to believe what Pat found out about Bobby's dog." By evening, every person in the 2,847 resident town knew that their neighbor had been living with a wolf for 3 years. The reactions split the community down the middle like a lightning strike through an old oak. At Miller's General Store, heated arguments erupted between the coffee drinkers who gathered every morning to solve the world's problems over black coffee and day-old donuts. "That animal could have killed any one of us," declared Frank Morrison, a retired trucker who'd moved to Millbrook for the peace and quiet. "Wolves are predators. It's in their nature." "Nature, my foot," countered Eleanor Walsh, the town librarian who'd been feeding stray cats for 30 years. "That wolf has been living among us peacefully." "If Midnight wanted to hurt someone, don't you think he would have done it by now?" Pastor William Bill Thompson found himself mediating disputes that had nothing to do with Scripture and everything to do with fear versus compassion. At 73, he'd seen his share of community divisions, but nothing quite like this. "God's creatures come in all forms," he told his congregation that Wednesday evening. "Sometimes the Lord sends us exactly what we need, even if it doesn't look like what we expected." The federal response came faster than anyone anticipated. Agent Derek Coleman of the USS Fish and Wildlife Service arrived in Millbrook on October 18th, driving a black SUV with government plates and carrying the kind of authority that made small-town sheriffs nervous. Coleman was a lean man in his mid-40s with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent years following rules that others found inconvenient. "Mr. Mitchell," Coleman said when Bobby answered his door that Thursday morning, "I'm here about the illegal wildlife you've been harboring." Bobby stood in his doorway, Midnight at his side, the wolf's massive presence making the federal agent take an involuntary step backward. "His name is Midnight, and he's family." "Sir, that animal is federal property. Wolves are protected under the Endangered Species Act, which means they belong to the American people, not to private individuals." Coleman's voice carried the patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "I'm authorized to seize the animal immediately." "You're authorized to try," Bobby replied, his hand resting on Midnight's head. The wolf hadn't moved, but his amber eyes were locked on Coleman with an intensity that made the agent's hand drift toward his sidearm. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't want this to become unpleasant. You have 72 hours to voluntarily surrender the animal. If you refuse, I'll return with a federal warrant and whatever force is necessary to complete the seizure." After Coleman left, Bobby sat on his porch watching Midnight patrol the yard's perimeter. The wolf moved with purpose, checking scent markers, investigating sounds that Bobby's human ears couldn't detect. For the first time, Bobby saw past the domesticated behaviors to the wild intelligence underneath. Midnight wasn't just a large dog with unusual habits. He was a predator who'd chosen to protect rather than hunt, to love rather than survive alone. The phone calls started within hours. Rebecca "Becky" Foster, Millbrook's only lawyer, offered to work pro bono. "Federal overreach," she called it. "They can't just waltz into our town and destroy a family." The Virginia Wildlife Coalition pledged support. Animal rights activists began organizing protests. A reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch called for an interview. But it was Martha Henderson's kitchen table strategy session that truly galvanized the community. 23 people crowded into her small dining room on Friday evening, ranging in age from Pastor Thompson's 30-year-old son to 91-year-old Mrs. Chen, who'd lived in Millbrook longer than anyone except the mountains themselves. "This isn't just about Bobby and Midnight," Martha declared, her silver hair catching the lamplight as she gestured emphatically. "This is about whether government bureaucrats can come into our town and tear apart families just because they don't fit some regulation written by people who've never lived with the consequences." "But what if the wolf does become dangerous?" asked Dr. James Patterson, Millbrook's only physician. "What if something triggers his wild instincts?" Before anyone could answer, the debate was interrupted by commotion outside. Through Martha's kitchen window, they could see lights moving through the forest behind Bobby's property. Flashlights, moving in formation, searching. "Someone's missing," Martha said, reaching for her phone to call Sheriff Williams. The missing person was 6-year-old Tommy Patterson, Dr. Patterson's grandson, who'd wandered away from his babysitter during an afternoon adventure in the woods. The child had been gone for 4 hours, and temperatures were dropping toward freezing as night fell over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sheriff Williams had organized search parties, but the darkness and thick forest made the effort nearly hopeless. Tommy could be anywhere within a 5-mile radius, and at 6 years old, he might not respond to calling voices if he was scared or injured. That's when Midnight made his choice. Bobby was standing on his porch watching the distant flashlights when the wolf suddenly went rigid beside him. Midnight's ears pricked forward, his nose working the air with intense concentration. Without warning, the wolf bounded off the porch and began moving through the forest with purpose, not the random searching of the human volunteers, but the directed tracking of a predator who'd caught a scent. "Midnight, no!" Bobby called, but the wolf was already disappearing into the darkness. Bobby grabbed his heaviest flashlight and followed, his 67-year-old legs protesting the rough terrain. He could hear Midnight ahead of him, moving through the underbrush with the silent grace of a creature born for wilderness navigation. The wolf paused occasionally, waiting for Bobby to catch up, then continued deeper into the forest. 20 minutes later, Midnight led Bobby to an old mining shaft that hadn't been used since the 1940s. The wolf was sitting at the edge of the opening, whining softly. Bobby's flashlight beam revealed Tommy Patterson 12 feet below, conscious but trapped on a narrow ledge, too scared to move. "Tommy, can you hear me?" Bobby called down. "Mr. Mitchell?" The child's voice was small and frightened. "I fell down and can't get out. My ankle really hurts." Bobby immediately called Sheriff Williams on his cell phone, reporting their location. While they waited for rescue equipment, Midnight lay down at the edge of the shaft, his massive head visible to Tommy below. The wolf's presence seemed to calm the child, who talked to the animal as if they were old friends. "He's really a wolf?" Tommy asked, his young voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "Yes, he is," Bobby replied. "He's beautiful. Is he going to stay?" Bobby looked at Midnight, whose amber eyes reflected the flashlight beam like twin stars. "I don't know, son. I honestly don't know." The rescue took 2 hours, with volunteer firefighters and paramedics working by floodlight to safely extract Tommy from the shaft. The child had a sprained ankle and mild hypothermia, but was otherwise unharmed. As the ambulance prepared to transport him to the regional hospital, Tommy insisted on saying goodbye to Midnight. "Thank you for finding me," the boy whispered, his small hand touching the wolf's massive head. "You're a good dog, even if you're really a wolf." By morning, the story had spread beyond Millbrook. A wolf had led rescuers to a missing child, potentially saving the boy's life. The same animal that Agent Coleman wanted to seize as dangerous had demonstrated exactly the opposite behavior when it mattered most. The phone in Bobby's kitchen rang constantly. News crews requested interviews. Wildlife experts wanted to study Midnight's tracking abilities. Animal behaviorists called to discuss the unprecedented case of a wolf functioning as a search and rescue animal. But the most important call came from Agent Coleman himself. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been monitoring the situation. The animal's behavior last night was unusual for a wild wolf." "Midnight isn't wild," Bobby replied. "He's family. And now the whole world knows what I've known for 3 years. He's not dangerous. He's protective. Nevertheless, federal law is federal law. I'll be returning Monday morning with authorization to seize the animal. I strongly advise you not to interfere. Agent Coleman, with all due respect, you can go straight to hell." Bobby hung up the phone and looked at Midnight, who was lying in his usual spot beside the kitchen table, watching his human with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "Well, boy, looks like we're about to find out what this town is really made of." Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray October sky that made even the autumn leaves look mournful. Bobby stood at his kitchen window, watching the black government SUVs roll up his gravel driveway like a funeral procession. 4 vehicles, 12 federal agents, and enough firepower to handle a terrorist threat, all for one wolf who'd spent the weekend being hand-fed bacon scraps by visiting children. Agent Coleman emerged from the lead vehicle wearing tactical gear that made him look more like a soldier than a wildlife officer. Behind him came agents carrying tranquilizer guns, capture equipment, and the kind of grim determination that suggested they'd done this dance before with other families who'd made the mistake of loving the wrong species. "This is it, boy," Bobby murmured to Midnight, who stood beside him with calm dignity, as if he understood that this moment had been inevitable from the day Bobby first brought him home. "Whatever happens, you remember that you saved me first. Everything else is just details." But as the federal agents assembled on Bobby's front lawn, they discovered they weren't alone. Overnight, Millbrook had transformed itself into a fortress of small-town solidarity that would have made David proud in his standoff with Goliath. Martha Henderson stood at the edge of Bobby's property line, flanked by every member of the Millbrook Baptist Church Choir. Pastor Thompson held a sign reading, "God's creatures deserve God's love," while Eleanor Walsh had organized the library volunteers into a human chain blocking the driveway. Dr. Patterson arrived with his medical bag, announcing loudly that he was there to monitor the welfare of both the animal and any humans who might be injured in what he called this unconscionable federal overreach. But it was the children who delivered the most powerful statement. Tommy Patterson, still limping slightly from his sprained ankle, sat cross-legged directly in front of Bobby's porch steps. "Midnight saved my life," the 6-year-old announced to Agent Coleman. "You can't take away someone's hero." Behind Tommy, 17 other children from Millbrook Elementary had positioned themselves between the federal agents and the house. Their parents stood behind them, creating a barrier of human compassion that no amount of federal authority could easily overcome. "Ladies and gentlemen, you need to disperse immediately," Coleman announced through a megaphone. "You are interfering with a federal law enforcement operation. Anyone who refuses to leave will be subject to arrest." "Then you better bring more handcuffs," called out Frank Morrison, the same man who'd argued that midnight was dangerous just days earlier. "Because if you're arresting people for protecting families, you'll need to arrest the whole damn town." Sheriff Williams arrived as the standoff intensified, his patrol car parking strategically between the federal agents and the crowd. At 55, Williams had spent his entire career trying to keep peace in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. This was the most challenging situation he'd ever faced. "Agent Coleman, I need to speak with you privately," Williams said, his hand resting casually on his sidearm in a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Sheriff, this is a federal matter. I advise you not to interfere. And I advise you to remember that you're in my county, dealing with my people, and that wolf you want to take has become something of a local hero since Friday night." Williams stepped closer to Coleman, lowering his voice so only the federal agent could hear. "You really want to be the man who went viral for traumatizing children and destroying a family? Because I guarantee you half these people are already recording this on their phones." Coleman looked around at the crowd, noting the smartphones pointed in his direction, the news van that had just pulled up from the Richmond station, and the growing number of vehicles parking along the county road. What should have been a simple animal seizure was becoming a public relations nightmare. "Mr. Mitchell," Coleman called out, "come outside so we can discuss this reasonably." Bobby emerged from his house with Midnight at his side, the wolf's massive presence causing several agents to shift nervously. But Midnight's attention wasn't on the federal officers, it was on Tommy Patterson, who immediately stood up and walked over to pet the animal's head with the fearless affection that only children could muster. "Agent Coleman," Bobby said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "this is my family. This is my home. And that wolf has done nothing but bring joy and safety to this community for 3 years. If you want him, you'll have to go through every person standing here today. Sir, federal law doesn't recognize emotional attachments to wildlife. That animal belongs in a proper facility where it can receive appropriate care." "Appropriate care?" Dr. Patterson stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "I've been monitoring that wolf's health for 3 years. He's in perfect condition, well socialized, and clearly bonded to both Bobby and this community. What facility could provide better care than a loving home and an entire town willing to protect him?" Agent Coleman was facing a dilemma that wasn't covered in any federal manual. Standard protocol called for him to arrest anyone interfering with the operation, but arresting an entire town, including elderly churchgoers, small children, and the local sheriff, would create exactly the kind of media spectacle that his superiors desperately wanted to avoid. The situation grew more complex when vehicles began arriving from outside Millbrook. Word of the standoff had spread through social media, bringing animal rights activists, wildlife advocates, and protesters from as far away as Richmond and Washington, D.C. The small mountain community was transforming into the center of a national debate about federal authority, individual rights, and the bonds between humans and animals. Rebecca Foster, Millbrook's lawyer, arrived with a briefcase full of legal documents and a determination that made Agent Coleman's jaw tighten. "Agent Coleman, I have preliminary injunction paperwork that will tie this case up in federal court for months," she announced. "My client is prepared to challenge both the seizure and the underlying authority of federal wildlife regulations as applied to animals that pose no threat to public safety." "Ma'am, you can't injunct federal law." "I can certainly try, and while I'm trying, that wolf stays exactly where he is." The standoff continued through the morning as more people arrived, more media crews set up cameras, and Agent Coleman made increasingly frantic phone calls to his superiors in Washington. The story was spreading beyond local news. CNN had picked it up, and the hashtag #SaveMidnight was trending on social media platforms. At noon, Tommy Patterson's grandmother arrived with sandwiches and thermoses of hot coffee for the protesters. "If we're going to make a stand," she announced, "we're going to do it properly fed." That's when Agent Coleman made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Everyone stand back," he ordered, raising his tranquilizer gun. "I'm taking the animal into custody, with or without cooperation." The crowd pressed closer instead of dispersing, creating a human shield around Bobby and Midnight. The wolf seemed to sense the escalating tension, his body coiling for action while his eyes remained locked on the armed federal agent. "Coleman, don't do this," Sheriff Williams warned. "You fire that dart in this crowd, someone's going to get hurt." "The animal is dangerous," Coleman replied, his voice rising with frustration and something that sounded suspiciously like panic. "All wolves are dangerous. That's why they're regulated." "Dangerous?" Martha Henderson stepped forward, her 72-year-old frame shaking with indignation. "That wolf has lived in this community for 3 years without harming a soul. He saved a child's life 4 days ago." "The only dangerous thing here is your ignorance." Agent Coleman's finger moved toward the trigger of his tranquilizer gun, and the crowd collectively held its breath. Midnight stepped protectively in front of Bobby, his massive frame positioned to shield his human from any threat. That's when everything changed. "Agent Coleman," a new voice called from the edge of the crowd. "I need to speak with you immediately." The speaker was Dr. Sarah Whitman, a wildlife biologist from Virginia Tech who'd been studying wolf populations in the region. She carried herself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades in the field, and her arrival brought a sudden hush to the confrontation. "Dr. Whitman," Coleman acknowledged, lowering his weapon slightly. "What are you doing here?" "I've been tracking wolf activity in this region for 15 years, she replied, walking purposefully toward the center of the standoff. "And I have information about this particular animal that changes everything." She approached Midnight fearlessly, her trained eyes cataloging every detail of his conformation, his behavior, his interaction with the humans around him. The wolf watched her approach but showed no aggression, no fear, only the calm assessment of a creature confident in his own power. "Agent Coleman, this isn't just any wolf. This is the last known eastern wolf in Virginia. His parents and siblings were killed by poachers 3 years ago, making him potentially the most genetically valuable animal in the state." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying the weight of scientific authority. "What you're witnessing here isn't just a man and his pet. It's a conservation miracle. This wolf chose to bond with humans rather than die alone in the wilderness. That choice may have saved his subspecies from complete extinction in Virginia." Agent Coleman stared at her, his tranquilizer gun now hanging loosely at his side. Extinct. The report said eastern wolves were locally extinct, not endangered. Locally extinct means we thought they were all gone from this region. But clearly, we were wrong. This animal represents a genetic line that we desperately need to preserve. Seizing him now, stressing him with captivity and relocation, could kill him and destroy any chance of breeding programs that might restore his subspecies to Virginia. Bobby listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Midnight wasn't just his beloved companion. He was a living piece of Virginia's natural history, a bridge between the wilderness that once covered these mountains and the possibility of restoration that could benefit future generations. "What are you proposing, Dr. Whitman?" Coleman asked. "I'm proposing that we rethink our approach. This wolf has demonstrated remarkable adaptability and socialization. Rather than treating him as a problem to be solved, maybe we should recognize him as a success story to be studied and protected." The federal agent looked around at the crowd of determined faces, the media cameras recording his every word, and the wolf at the center of it all who'd somehow become a symbol of something larger than anyone had imagined. "I need to make some calls," Coleman said finally, holstering his tranquilizer gun. The 3 hours that followed Agent Coleman's phone calls would later be remembered as the longest afternoon in Millbrook's history. The crowd maintained their vigil while Coleman paced behind his government vehicles, his cell phone pressed to his ear in increasingly heated conversations with federal officials who were watching their quiet wildlife enforcement operation become a national news story. Bobby sat on his porch steps with Midnight beside him, the wolf's massive head resting against his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that wasn't lost on the gathered crowd. Despite the chaos surrounding them, the bond between man and wolf remained unshaken, a living testament to the power of love to transcend the boundaries that humans insisted on creating between species. "You know what's going to happen, don't you, boy?" Bobby whispered, his weathered hand stroking Midnight's thick fur. "Either way this ends, nothing's ever going to be the same." Martha Henderson approached with a thermos of coffee and the kind of determined expression that had made her a force to be reckoned with in Millbrook for 72 years. "Bobby Mitchell, you stop that doom and gloom thinking right now. We've got half the county here, news crews from 3 states, and enough lawyers to choke a horse. That federal boy doesn't know what he's gotten himself into." But Bobby's concern went deeper than the immediate standoff. Even if they won this battle, even if Midnight stayed, the secret was out. The quiet life they'd built together over 3 years was over forever. Their story would become public property, dissected by experts, debated by politicians, and romanticized by people who'd never experienced the daily reality of loving something the world considered dangerous. At 3:30 p.m., Agent Coleman's phone conversations took on a different tone. Instead of the clipped, authoritative exchanges he'd been having all afternoon, his voice became deferential, almost pleading. Dr. Whitman, who'd been monitoring his body language with scientific precision, noted the change immediately. "He's talking to someone with real authority now," she murmured to Sheriff Williams. "Someone who can actually make decisions about this case." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Patterson, the 6-year-old boy whose rescue had sparked the community's rallying cry, had been quietly drawing pictures while the adults argued. His latest creation was a crayon masterpiece showing a large black wolf leading rescuers to a hole in the ground where a small figure waited to be saved. When a CNN reporter knelt down to interview the child, Tommy held up his drawing with the proud confidence that only small children possessed. "This is Midnight saving me," he explained to the camera. "He's not scary. He's a hero. Heroes don't belong in cages." The interview, broadcast live on national television, became the tipping point that federal officials could no longer ignore. Within minutes, Agent Coleman's phone was ringing with calls from Washington officials who'd been watching the story unfold in real time. The final call came from Assistant Secretary of the Interior Margaret Chen, whose authority superseded everyone on the ground in Millbrook. Coleman's side of the conversation was limited to "yes, ma'am" and "I understand, ma'am," but his increasingly pale complexion told the story of a man receiving orders that contradicted everything he'd been trained to do. When Coleman finally ended the call, he stood motionless for several minutes, staring at the crowd of people who'd spent their entire day defending a family that most of the world would consider impossible. Dr. Whitman approached him carefully, recognizing the expression of a man whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. "Agent Coleman, what are your orders?" Coleman cleared his throat and stepped forward to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received word from the Department of the Interior. Due to the unprecedented nature of this case and the animal's demonstrated value both to conservation and to public safety, a special exemption is being considered under the Endangered Species Act." A murmur of hope rippled through the crowd, but Coleman held up his hand for silence. "However, this exemption comes with strict conditions. The animal must undergo comprehensive behavioral and health assessments. The living situation must meet federal standards for wildlife care, and there must be ongoing monitoring to ensure public safety." Bobby stood up slowly, midnight rising beside him like a black shadow given substance. "What does that mean in plain English, Agent Coleman?" "It means, Mr. Mitchell, that if you're willing to work with us, there might be a way for you to keep your companion. But it would mean accepting federal oversight, regular inspections, and modifications to your property to meet wildlife containment standards." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Bobby remained silent, his hand resting on Midnight's head as he considered the implications. Federal oversight meant strangers with clipboards showing up regularly to judge whether his love for Midnight met their bureaucratic standards. Property modifications meant fences, permits, and restrictions that would turn his home into something between a zoo and a prison. "And if I refuse these conditions?" Bobby asked. Coleman's expression softened slightly. "Then we're back to seizure and relocation. But Mr. Mitchell, this offer won't come again. My superiors are taking enormous political risk, even considering this exemption." Dr. Whitman stepped forward. "Bobby, what Agent Coleman isn't telling you is that this could set a precedent for human-wolf coexistence programs nationwide. Your situation with Midnight could pave the way for other conservation efforts, other cases where the bond between humans and wildlife serves a greater purpose." Bobby looked down at Midnight, whose amber eyes seemed to hold centuries of wild wisdom. The wolf had never asked to be a symbol, never volunteered to become a test case for federal policy. All he'd ever wanted was the same thing Bobby had wanted after losing Katie and Grace. Someone to love who would love him back unconditionally. "I need some time to think," Bobby said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Coleman replied. "I'll be staying at the Millbrook Inn tonight. Your answer will determine how this ends." As the federal agents packed their equipment and the crowd began to disperse, Bobby remained on his porch with Midnight, watching the sun set behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. The crisis had passed, but the weight of decision pressed down on him like the approaching darkness. Martha Henderson was the last to leave, her concern evident in every line of her weathered face. "Bobby, honey, you know we'll support whatever you decide, but think about what this means for other folks who might find themselves in your situation someday." After she left, Bobby and Midnight sat in the growing twilight, two survivors who'd found each other in the aftermath of separate tragedies. The wolf's breathing was calm and steady, his massive presence a comfort that Bobby had relied upon through 3 years of grief and healing. "What do you think, boy?" Bobby asked quietly. "Do we take their deal and live in a fishbowl, or do we make our own choice about how this story ends?" Midnight's response was to move closer, pressing his warm bulk against Bobby's legs in the same gesture of comfort he'd offered every day since that October night 3 years ago. The wolf didn't care about federal regulations, conservation precedents, or media attention. He only understood loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bond they'd forged in their shared solitude. As the stars emerged overhead, Bobby made his decision. Tomorrow, he would give Agent Coleman his answer, and whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but the future of human-wildlife relationships in a world that too often saw love and law as incompatible forces. The night air carried the scent of autumn leaves and approaching winter, reminders that seasons changed but some bonds endured beyond the power of time or government to break. Bobby closed his eyes and listened to Midnight's steady breathing, storing up the peace of this moment against whatever storms lay ahead. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he whispered to the wolf who'd saved his life by teaching him how to love again, "you remember that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Everything else is just paperwork." Midnight's tail moved in a single, slow sweep against the porch boards, the only response needed between two souls who understood that love, once given freely, could never truly be taken away. The morning of October 22nd arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the Blue Ridge Mountains look like a painting come to life. Bobby woke to find Midnight's usual spot beside his bed empty, the first time in 3 years that the wolf hadn't been there to greet the dawn. Panic shot through his chest as he called out, but his fear dissolved when he found Midnight on the front porch, sitting perfectly still, watching the sunrise with an intensity that seemed almost spiritual. "You know something's different today, don't you, boy?" Bobby said, settling into his rocking chair beside the massive wolf. "Animals always know before we do." At 9 a.m. sharp, Agent Coleman's black SUV pulled into the driveway, followed by Dr. Whitman's research vehicle and a van from the Richmond Animal Control that made Bobby's stomach clench with dread. Whatever decision he made this morning would change everything. But the arrival of the animal control van suggested that federal patience had reached its limit. Agent Coleman approached the porch with the measured stride of a man who'd spent the night reconciling duty with conscience. Behind him, Dr. Whitman carried a thick folder of documents that looked suspiciously like contracts and permits. The animal control officers remained by their van, but their presence sent a clear message about the consequences of refusing federal cooperation. "Mr. Mitchell," Coleman began, "have you reached a decision about the exemption terms?" Bobby stood slowly, his hand automatically moving to rest on Midnight's head. The wolf remained perfectly calm, but Bobby could feel the subtle tension in his muscles, the coiled readiness of a predator who understood that something important was happening. "Agent Coleman, before I give you my answer, I need to know something. If I refuse your terms and you take Midnight, what exactly happens to him?" Coleman's expression darkened. "Sir, that's not relevant to your decision." "The hell it's not relevant!" Bobby cut him off, his voice carrying the steel that had helped him survive 40 years of railroad work and 3 years of grief. "You're asking me to sign my life away to bureaucrats who see my family as a case study. I deserve to know what happens if I say no." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, her scientific objectivity warring with obvious compassion. "Bobby, the truth is that relocation rarely works with wolves who've been socialized to humans. Midnight wouldn't adapt well to captivity or reintroduction to the wild. Most facilities would recommend euthanasia as the most humane option." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Euthanasia, the clinical term for murder when applied to an animal whose only crime was loving the wrong species. Bobby felt his knees go weak as the full weight of the choice crashed down on him. "So my options are federal supervision for the rest of his life, or you kill him?" "Mr. Mitchell," Coleman started. "No, that's exactly what you're saying. Submit to government control or watch them murder my family." Bobby's voice broke on the last word, and Midnight moved closer, pressing against his legs in the same gesture of comfort he'd offered countless times before. That's when the morning took its most devastating turn. The sound started as a distant whine, barely audible above the mountain breeze. But Midnight's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The wolf's ears flattened against his skull, his body dropping into a defensive crouch, and a low growl rumbled from his chest, the first sound of pure aggression Bobby had ever heard from him. The helicopter appeared over the ridge like a mechanical vulture, its rotors cutting through the peaceful morning with military precision. Agent Coleman stepped back in surprise, his hand moving to his radio. "This isn't one of ours," he said, clearly confused. But Bobby understood immediately. The growl in Midnight's throat, the way his massive body trembled with barely contained terror, the wild look in his amber eyes, this wasn't just fear. This was trauma, deep and primal, triggered by a sound that connected to memories Midnight had carried for 3 years. "Get that thing away from here," Bobby shouted over the rotor noise, but the helicopter was already settling into the field beside his house, its downwash flattening the grass and sending autumn leaves spiraling through the air. 2 men emerged from the aircraft, not federal agents but civilians dressed in hunting gear. The older man moved with the swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and money. The younger one carried a high-powered rifle and wore the expression of someone who enjoyed his work too much. "Agent Coleman," the older man called out. "I'm Marcus Reed, private wildlife contractor. We're here to assist with the wolf situation." Coleman looked genuinely confused. "Sir, I didn't request any contractors. This is a federal operation." "Orders came down from above," Reed replied, pulling out official-looking documents. "We're authorized to handle the capture and removal of dangerous wildlife when local resources are insufficient." Bobby felt ice water flooding his veins as he recognized something in Reed's eyes, a coldness that had nothing to do with professional duty and everything to do with personal satisfaction. This man wasn't here to capture Midnight. He was here to kill him. Midnight's terror was escalating beyond anything Bobby had witnessed. The wolf was no longer just growling. He was backing toward the house, his massive frame shaking with trauma-induced panic. His amber eyes were wild, unfocused, seeing not the present moment but some terrible memory that the helicopter had awakened. "Bobby," Dr. Whitman said urgently, "something's wrong. This isn't normal fear behavior. Midnight's having a trauma response." "Of course he's having a trauma response," Bobby snapped. "How do you think he became an orphan 3 years ago? How do you think his family died?" The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Midnight's terror of the helicopter, his violent reaction to the men with guns, his 3 years of healing from injuries that Bobby had never fully understood, this wasn't his first encounter with hunters arriving from the sky. Reed stepped closer, his false smile not quite hiding the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, we understand you've become attached to this animal, but it's time to face reality. Wolves are dangerous, unpredictable creatures. The kindest thing we can do is end this situation quickly and humanely." "Humanely?" Bobby's voice cracked with outrage. "You want to murder my family and call it humane?" "It's not murder when it's a wild animal, sir. It's wildlife management." That's when Midnight made his choice. Instead of fleeing into the forest where his speed and knowledge of the terrain might have given him a chance, the wolf moved protectively between Bobby and the armed men. His massive frame filled the space between the hunters and his human family, and despite his obvious terror, he held his ground. Reed raised his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Stand aside, Mr. Mitchell. This needs to happen." "Like hell it does," Bobby said, stepping in front of Midnight despite the wolf's attempts to shield him. "You want him, you go through me first." Agent Coleman finally found his voice. "Mr. Reed, I need to see those authorization documents." "This operation wasn't cleared through my office." "Your office isn't the only authority here, Agent Coleman. Some situations require immediate action. Dr. Whitman was studying Reed with growing suspicion. "Mr. Reed, what company did you say you work for? I know most of the legitimate wildlife contractors in Virginia." Reed's smile faltered slightly. "That's not relevant to the current situation, Dr. Whitman. What's relevant is removing a dangerous predator from a residential area before someone gets hurt." "The only dangerous predator I see," came a new voice, "is you." Sheriff Williams had arrived without fanfare, his patrol car sliding to a stop between Reed's helicopter and the house. Behind him came 3 more vehicles: Martha Henderson's old Buick, Pastor Thompson's pickup truck, and Dr. Patterson's sedan. The same community that had rallied yesterday was reconvening, but this time the threat wasn't federal bureaucracy. This time, the threat was armed and smiling. "Sheriff," Reed said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "this is a federal matter. You don't have jurisdiction here." "Actually, I do," Williams replied, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "This is my county, and any discharge of firearms requires my authorization. I don't recall giving any such authorization to private contractors." Martha Henderson was already on her phone, and Bobby could hear her voice carrying across the yard. "Yes, I need the Richmond TV station Channel 8 news desk. We've got armed hunters threatening a family pet in Millbrook." Reed's expression shifted from confident to concerned as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The helicopter pilot was watching nervously from the aircraft, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation developing around his landing zone. "Mr. Reed, Doctor," Whitman said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with bureaucrats and contractors, "I'm going to need to see those authorization documents now. Something about this doesn't feel right." Reed's hand tightened on his rifle. "The documents are in order. Now stand aside and let us do our job." "Your job?" Bobby stepped closer, midnight moving with him like a black shadow. "Your job is to come onto my property and threaten my family. Your job is to terrorize an animal that's never hurt a soul." "That animal," Reed snarled, his professional facade finally cracking, "is a killer. All wolves are killers. It's in their nature to hunt, to kill, to destroy everything that decent people try to build." The raw hatred in Reed's voice revealed something that went far beyond professional duty. This was personal, driven by some deep-seated rage that had nothing to do with wildlife management and everything to do with revenge. "Who are you really, Doctor?" Whitman demanded. "And why do you want this particular wolf dead so badly?" Reed's answer came not in words, but in the sound of his rifle's safety clicking off. The metallic click echoed across the yard like a death knell, freezing everyone in place. Everyone except Midnight. The wolf's trauma-induced panic transformed in an instant into something far more dangerous. The protective fury of a creature who'd chosen love over survival. With a speed that defied his massive size, Midnight launched himself not at Reed, but past him, positioning himself between the armed man and the growing crowd of townspeople who'd arrived to help. The wolf that had spent 3 years learning to be gentle remembered, in that crucial moment, how to be deadly. The standoff lasted exactly 7 seconds before Sheriff Williams drew his weapon and pointed it at Marcus Reed. "Drop the rifle, now!" Reed's finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes locked on Midnight's massive form. The wolf stood perfectly still between the gunman and the crowd of townspeople, every muscle coiled for action, but his amber eyes remained fixed on Bobby with an expression that spoke of absolute trust and unwavering love. "Sheriff, you're making a mistake," Reed said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "That animal needs to be destroyed before it kills someone." "The only one threatening to kill anyone here is you," Williams replied. "Now drop the weapon and step away from the helicopter." That's when Agent Coleman made a discovery that changed everything. While Reed and the sheriff faced off, Coleman had been examining the authorization documents with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years dealing with federal paperwork. What he found made his face go pale with understanding. "Sheriff Williams," Coleman called out, his voice carrying across the tense yard. "Arrest this man immediately. These documents are forgeries, and Marcus Reed isn't a federal contractor. According to his fingerprints in the system, his real name is Derek Mason, and he's wanted for poaching violations in 3 states. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. This wasn't a legitimate wildlife operation. It was a revenge mission carried out by a man with forged federal documents and a personal vendetta against wolves. Reed's facade crumbled entirely. "You don't understand," he snarled, his rifle still trained on Midnight. "3 years ago, that wolf killed my brother. Tom was hunting legally, following all the regulations. When that black devil and his pack attacked, Tom never made it home." "That's impossible," Dr. Whitman said firmly. "Midnight was a juvenile 3 years ago, barely old enough to hunt with his pack. He couldn't have killed anyone." "His pack did it?" Reed screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "They surrounded Tom's hunting blind, worked together like the monsters they are. And when I found Tom's body, that black wolf was standing over him like he was proud of what they'd done." Bobby felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Reed, where did this happen?" "Blue Ridge National Forest, October 15th, 3 years ago. The same night I tracked the pack back to their den and made sure they'd never kill anyone again." The date hit Bobby like a sledgehammer. October 15th, 3 years ago, the same night he'd found Midnight bleeding and broken on Route 211. The same night he'd been driving toward his own death until a small black creature in his headlights had given him a reason to live. "You killed his family," Bobby whispered, the horrible truth spreading through him like poison. "You murdered his parents, his siblings, and then you hunted him for 3 years because he survived." "Damn right I did," Reed replied, his mask of sanity slipping completely. "And now I'm going to finish the job." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, her scientific mind putting together pieces that painted a picture of tragedy and obsession. "Mr. Reed, I've studied the wildlife reports from that area. Your brother wasn't killed by wolves. He died of a heart attack while hunting illegally in a protected sanctuary. The wolves you slaughtered were just trying to protect their territory from an armed intruder." "Lies!" Reed shrieked. "Tom was a good man, a God-fearing hunter who followed all the rules. Those monsters murdered him, and I made them pay for it." But his story was falling apart under the weight of scrutiny and revealed hatred. Agent Coleman was already on his radio, calling for backup and requesting immediate investigation of the Reed/Mason case. The helicopter pilot was distancing himself from his passenger, clearly realizing he'd been hired under false pretenses. Sheriff Williams moved closer, his weapon steady. "Mr. Reed, or Mason, or whatever your name is, you're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer, possession of forged documents, and threatening the peace. Drop your weapon now." Instead of complying, Reed swung his rifle toward the crowd of townspeople. "You people don't understand what you're protecting. That thing isn't a pet. It's a killer. And when it finally snaps, when it remembers what it really is, your children will pay the price." That's when Midnight made his choice. The wolf had remained motionless throughout the confrontation, but Reed's threat to the townspeople, to Tommy Patterson and the other children who'd defended him, triggered something deeper than training or instinct. With fluid grace that belied his massive size, Midnight bounded forward, not to attack, but to knock Reed's rifle skyward as the man fired. The shot went harmlessly into the October sky, but the impact sent Reed sprawling backward. Before he could recover, Sheriff Williams was on him, wrestling the weapon away while Agent Coleman moved in with handcuffs. "No!" Reed screamed as the cuffs clicked shut. "You don't understand what you've done." That wolf is a killer. He'll destroy everything you love." But his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd had seen what really happened. Midnight could have torn Reed's throat out, could have used his natural weapons to end the threat permanently. Instead, the wolf had chosen the minimum force necessary to protect the humans he loved, showing more restraint and judgment than the man who'd spent 3 years hunting him. Bobby knelt beside Midnight, his trembling hands checking the wolf for injuries. "Are you okay, boy? Are you hurt?" Midnight pressed his massive head against Bobby's chest, his breathing gradually slowing from the adrenaline rush. The trauma response was fading, replaced by the calm confidence of a creature who'd faced his greatest fear and emerged victorious. Dr. Whitman approached cautiously, her eyes bright with scientific wonder and human compassion. "Bobby, do you realize what just happened here?" Midnight recognized Reed as his family's killer, but instead of seeking revenge, he chose protection. That level of moral reasoning in a wild animal is unprecedented. As Reed was loaded into Sheriff Williams's patrol car, still ranting about killer wolves and divine justice, Agent Coleman approached Bobby with the expression that mixed professional respect with personal admiration. "Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology. When I arrived here yesterday, I thought I was dealing with a dangerous situation that needed immediate federal intervention. Now I realize I was witnessing something extraordinary, a bond between species that transcends everything we think we know about wildlife behavior." Bobby looked down at Midnight, who was lying peacefully beside him, showing no signs of the trauma or aggression that Reed had insisted was inevitable. "Agent Coleman, Midnight isn't dangerous because he's a wolf. He's extraordinary because he's family, and family protects each other, no matter what species they belong to." "I understand that now," Coleman replied, "which is why I'm recommending that the Department of Interior establish a new category of protected status, one that recognizes the unique circumstances of this case and allows for supervised coexistence between humans and wildlife when such bonds serve conservation and community interests." The proposal was unprecedented, but then again, so was everything about Bobby and Midnight's relationship. Over the next hour, as media crews arrived and federal officials conferred by telephone with Washington authorities, a new framework began to emerge, one that would allow Midnight to remain with Bobby under special conservation status, serving as both beloved family member and living symbol of the possibility for harmony between humans and wildlife. Tommy Patterson was the first to approach Midnight after the crisis ended, his 6-year-old fearlessness intact despite the morning's drama. "Midnight, you're the bravest wolf in the whole world," he declared, wrapping his small arms around the massive animal's neck. "Thank you for keeping us safe." Midnight's tail moved in a slow, gentle wag, the first truly relaxed gesture Bobby had seen from him since the helicopter arrived. The wolf that had faced his family's killer with courage and restraint was once again the gentle giant who played with children and brought comfort to a grieving old man. As the sun reached its midday peak over the Blue Ridge Mountains, Bobby realized that their story had come full circle. 3 years ago, a traumatized creature had saved a suicidal man on a dark mountain road. Today, that same creature had saved an entire community from the hatred and violence that had already destroyed one family. "You know what this means, don't you, boy?" Bobby said quietly, scratching behind Midnight's ears. "We're not going anywhere. You're home, I'm home, and all these people are our family now." Midnight's response was to settle more comfortably beside Bobby's chair, his amber eyes surveying the dispersing crowd with the calm satisfaction of a guardian whose watch had ended successfully. The wolf who'd learned to love was finally truly free, not because he'd escaped captivity, but because he'd chosen connection over isolation, forgiveness over revenge, and family over everything else that didn't really matter in the end. The mountain air carried the scent of autumn leaves and approaching winter, but Bobby felt only warmth as he sat beside his extraordinary companion, surrounded by a community that had proven love could overcome even federal regulations and armed hatred. Some stories, Bobby realized, weren't about endings at all. They were about new beginnings, second chances, and the miracle of finding family in the most unexpected places. 6 months later, Bobby Mitchell stood on his expanded porch watching the most remarkable sight he'd witnessed in his 70 years of life. In the meadow behind his property, now officially designated as the Blue Ridge Wolf Conservation Sanctuary, Midnight was teaching 3 young eastern wolf pups the delicate art of coexistence with humans. The pups, born to a female wolf relocated from a breeding program in North Carolina, had been placed with Midnight as their surrogate father. Under his patient guidance, they were learning that humans could be trusted, that children's laughter was nothing to fear, and that protection didn't always require aggression. Dr. Sarah Whitman documented everything from her research station, a converted trailer that had become the sanctuary's headquarters. Her published papers on the Millbrook Miracle had revolutionized thinking about wolf-human relationships and earned her a MacArthur Fellowship. But more importantly to Bobby, she'd become a friend who understood that love between species wasn't a scientific anomaly. It was a natural wonder that deserved respect and protection. Hard to believe it's only been 6 months since Agent Coleman showed up to take him away, Martha Henderson said, settling into the rocking chair beside Bobby's with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd appointed herself his unofficial supervisor. Bobby smiled, watching Midnight demonstrate to the pups how to accept treats from visiting children without knocking them over with enthusiasm. Sometimes the best things happen when you think your world is ending, Martha. Katie used to say that every door that closes just means there's a better one waiting to open. The sanctuary had transformed not just Bobby's property, but the entire town of Millbrook. Tourism revenue from wolf-watching expeditions had revitalized local businesses. The elementary school now hosted educational programs that taught children about conservation and the importance of protecting endangered species. Pastor Thompson had added a section about God's creatures to his weekly sermons, and the congregation had voted to adopt wolf conservation as their primary mission project. Most remarkably, Tommy Patterson had never missed a day visiting Midnight since his rescue 6 months earlier. The boy who'd been saved by a wolf was already talking about becoming a wildlife biologist, inspired by daily interactions with creatures he'd learned to see as friends rather than monsters. "Mr. Bobby," Tommy called out, running across the meadow with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old. "Midnight's teaching the babies how to play fetch, but they keep trying to eat the ball." Bobby laughed, the sound coming easier now than it had in years. "Well, son, they're still learning the difference between toys and food. Give them time." Agent Coleman had become a regular visitor, bringing updates on the federal legislation that would make the Millbrook model available to other communities facing human-wildlife conflicts. The man who'd arrived 6 months ago with tranquilizer guns and federal warrants now spent his weekends helping maintain the sanctuary's visitor trails and educational displays. "You know, Bobby," Coleman said during his last visit, "I've been a wildlife officer for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what you and Midnight have accomplished here. You've changed how we think about conservation, about the relationship between humans and wild animals." But for Bobby, the most meaningful transformation was the one he saw in his bathroom mirror each morning. The hollow-eyed man who'd planned his own death 3.5 years ago had been replaced by someone with purpose, joy, and a reason to wake up each day. Midnight hadn't just saved his life, he'd taught him how to live again. The Wolf Conservation Project had attracted attention from universities, wildlife organizations, and conservation groups across the country. Funding from federal grants, private donations, and educational partnerships had expanded the sanctuary to encompass 200 acres of protected habitat. But despite all the scientific interest and media attention, Bobby never forgot that at its heart, this was still the story of a man and his dog, even if that dog happened to be a wolf. Dr. Patricia Henderson, now the sanctuary's consulting veterinarian, made her weekly rounds with the satisfaction of someone who'd played a crucial role in something historically significant. Bobby, Midnight's latest health check shows him in perfect condition. His stress markers are lower than most domestic dogs I treat. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. What Bobby was doing was simply what he'd always done, loving Midnight as family, treating him with respect and kindness, and trusting that the bond they'd forged in grief and solitude was strong enough to withstand any challenge. The federal oversight he'd dreaded had turned out to be minimal and supportive, focused more on documenting their success than restricting their freedom. The three pups, Thunder, Storm, and Lightning, named by Tommy Patterson with the creative enthusiasm of childhood, were thriving under Midnight's guidance. Their integration into the sanctuary had proven that wolves could be socialized to coexist peacefully with humans while retaining their wild instincts and behaviors. It's like watching a master teacher, Dr. Whitman often told visitors. Midnight demonstrates behaviors, corrects mistakes gently, and somehow communicates complex social rules across species barriers. He's creating a new model for wildlife education. But Bobby saw something simpler and more profound in Midnight's interactions with the pups and the constant stream of visitors. He saw an animal who'd learned that love multiplied when shared, that protecting others was the highest calling, and that family wasn't defined by blood or species, but by choice and commitment. On quiet evenings, when the tourists had gone home and the research equipment was turned off, Bobby and Midnight would sit on the porch as they had for 3.5 years. The wolf would rest his massive head on Bobby's knee, and they'd watch the stars emerge over the Blue Ridge Mountains, two survivors who'd found their way back to joy through the simple miracle of caring for each other. "You know what I realized today, boy?" Bobby said during one of their sunset conversations. "Grace would have loved this. All those stuffed animals she practiced veterinary medicine on, all her dreams about saving hurt creatures, you're living proof that her dreams came true, even if she's not here to see it." Midnight's response was the same gentle pressure against Bobby's leg that had comforted him through 3 years of grief and healing. The wolf understood loss, understood the weight of carrying love for those who were gone, and somehow knew that the greatest tribute to the dead was continuing to love the living. The sanctuary's guest book filled with stories from visitors who'd been touched by witnessing the bond between Bobby and Midnight. A widow from Richmond wrote about finding hope after her husband's death. A veteran from Norfolk described how seeing Midnight's trauma recovery had inspired his own healing journey. Children drew pictures of wolves and families that expanded their understanding of what love could look like. Sheriff Williams, now in his final year before retirement, often stopped by to check on the sanctuary and marveled at how a federal crisis had transformed into a community triumph. "Bobby, I've been keeping the peace in this county for 30 years. But I've never seen anything bring people together like you and that wolf did. Kinda makes you believe in miracles." Martha Henderson, appointed by popular acclaim as the sanctuary's volunteer coordinator, had discovered a new purpose in her golden years. "I spent 40 years raising children and grandchildren," she told a visiting reporter. "Now I'm helping raise a whole new generation of people who understand that love doesn't recognize species boundaries." As autumn returned to the Blue Ridge Mountains, marking 1 full year since the crisis that had nearly torn them apart, Bobby reflected on the journey that had brought him from the edge of suicide to the center of a conservation miracle. The man who'd lost everything had found more than he'd ever imagined possible. And the wolf who'd lost his birth family had created a chosen family that spanned species and touched thousands of lives. The phone rang inside the house, probably another interview request, another research proposal, another opportunity to share their story with the world. But Bobby didn't move from his rocking chair, didn't disturb the peaceful evening ritual that had sustained them through every challenge. "Let them wait, boy," he said to Midnight, whose amber eyes reflected the first stars of evening. "Right now it's just us, the way it's always been. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." Midnight's tail moved in a slow, contented sweep across the porch boards, and Bobby smiled as he realized that sometimes the most extraordinary stories were built from the simplest moments. A man and his wolf, watching the sunset over mountains that had witnessed their miracle, surrounded by the quiet certainty that love, once found, could overcome any obstacle the world might place in its path. Dear friends, Bobby's journey from the depths of grief to finding purpose through an unlikely companion reminds us that our greatest chapters might still be waiting to be written. At any age, love can find us in the most unexpected forms, whether through a rescued animal, a new friendship, or a community that becomes chosen family. Sometimes what saves us is simply opening our hearts to something different, something that doesn't fit our expectations, but fills a space we didn't even know was empty. The bond between Bobby and Midnight shows us that healing comes not from forgetting our losses, but from discovering that our capacity to love can expand beyond anything we thought possible. What unexpected blessing has entered your life when you thought your best days were behind you? How has caring for another, whether human or animal, helped heal your own heart? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today.